Welcome everybody to this online discussion, a joint online event jointly organized by the Austrian Institute for International Affairs, oiip, and UC, University of California, Berkeley Institute of European Studies, on the topic of transatlantic perceptions, Trump, Orban, Le Pen, Wilders, Kickl, the rise of right-wing populism, and the future of transatlantic partnership. My name is Cengiz Günay, and I'm the director of the Austrian Institute for International Affairs, here located in Vienna. Have a nice evening, and our colleagues joining from the United States on the other side of the Atlantic, on the Pacific coast, good morning to you. This event is, of course, very topical. Most recent electoral win of President Trump and Republicans, also the majority of seats in Congress. This is a new situation. Trump 2 isn't expected to be the same as Trump 1 administration. And on the other side of the Atlantic here in Europe, we have seen the rise of far-right parties in various European countries, the Netherlands, France, and Austria most recently. In the Austrian elections, the far-right FPÖ, Freedom Party, emerged as first party. And this is novel in Austrian history. And the far right has always played a role, but never been the first and largest party to be represented in parliament. Now Austria is in the process of coalition building, and it looks as if the far right will be left out from power and kept out from power. Anyways, we're going to discuss all these issues. Before I hand over to my co-chair, Jeroen de Wolf, I would just like to ask the audience to pose questions, if you have any, in the chat box. And at the end, towards the end of our discussion, which will be 1.5 hours max, we won't be probably able to pose all of them to our discussants, but to pick some of them. And you're welcome to contribute to the discussion through this chat box. Jeroen, would you like to take over?
Thank you so much, Cengiz. Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening from wherever in the world you may be joining us. Today, my name is Jeroen de Wolf. I'm the director of the UC Berkeley Institute of European Studies and also the co-director of Berkeley's Austrian Studies program, a program that we developed in close partnership with the Austrian Marshall Foundation, to which we added later other partners. And I'm very excited that today we're able to organize a first event with a new partner, the Austrian Institute for International Affairs. Very grateful to you, Cengiz, for organizing this joint event about transatlantic perspectives on the rise of the far right and far right populism. Of course, we all know that in many ways this is a global phenomenon, right? Think of countries like India or Turkey, but our focus today will be on the West, and more specifically on the case of the United States and West and Europe and the EU, as well as the UK. Allow me to extend my welcome to today's panelists, and we welcome to our session today my colleague, Akasemi Newsome, who is the Associate Director of UC Berkeley's Institute of European Studies. I also welcome Marianne Riddervold, who's a professor at the Norwegian Institute of Foreign Affairs and the Innlandet Norway University of Applied Sciences. Marianne has an affiliation with our Institute of European Studies as a senior fellow. I also welcome Wolfgang Petritsch, the president of the Austrian Institute for International Affairs and also the president of the Austrian Marshall Foundation. And I welcome Daniela Pisoiu, senior researcher at the Austrian Institute for International Affairs. So at this point, Cengiz, I turn it back to you to start our discussion.
Thank you very much. I think we have agreed to go in several rounds and pose questions to our participants. I would like to start with maybe a first assessment of the differences between far right and in Europe and what is considered to be populist far right in the United States. Akasemi, may I start with you? Well, how would you analyze the rise of Trumpism in the United States, and how, in your opinion, does it differ from what we know from European far-right parties?
Thank you so much, Cengiz. I think there are some very important similarities when we think about the rhetoric that was, in my view, unfortunately successfully deployed in the recent US presidential election, that was really dominated by harsh anti-immigrant rhetoric. And this approach in communications and the use of harsh anti-immigrant rhetoric is one that we've seen far-right populist parties in Western Europe also deploy with a success. And the successful use of anti-immigrant rhetoric in Germany by the AfD, in the Netherlands by Geert Wilders' party, of course, and then by Trump in the U.S. Presidential election campaign. This rhetoric against migration has been successfully deployed independent of actual figures of the numbers of migrants coming across the border in both the EU and in the US situation, where we've seen in both cases numbers falling over the past year or two. So I would say the important similarity would be this unfortunately successful use of harsh anti-immigrant rhetoric. When it comes to an important difference, one that I don't see really examined extensively in media, to a lesser extent in scholarly publications, has to do with the very different institutional environments that Trump faces in terms of a winner-take-all system with a two-party system versus the situation in Western European countries where we're dealing mainly with parliamentary-style government formation. So certain checks that are available in which mainstream center-right parties, mainstream center-left parties, Green parties can agree to construct cordons sanitaires or agree to construct firewalls around far-right parties, really are just not present in the US system, where we've seen Trump really test the guardrails and shown us that there is no bottom, unfortunately, in a two-party system. You can have one party that really goes full throttle in its attacks against immigrants and even against other US citizens. And people are still, at the end of the day, at the ballot box faced with one of two choices. So I think the institutional setting is different, and something to really be considered more deeply when assessing right-wing party populism in the US context versus in that of several Western European countries. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. Just a follow-up question, if I may, a short one. What was pretty surprising, probably for many outsiders, was that Trump did really well among communities that were considered, constituencies that were considered more Democrat, such as African Americans, Latinos, and so on. Working class has already shifted earlier towards the Republican Party. How come that these constituencies shifted towards Trump? So what was the rhetoric, the strategy to win them over?
Well, I believe votes are still being counted, so that commentators and scholars are revising their initial analytical takes, which in the hours after the Electoral College count was called for Trump, and language such as a landslide was used to describe Trump's percentages of the popular vote, has now since very much narrowed, and the new sort of focal point of the analysis is one of millions of voters who stayed home. So this, I think, addresses your question because many Democratic constituents, Latino minority groups, African American minority groups, did not come out at all in favor of the Democratic candidate, Kamala Harris, which I think is a different story than being swayed by the ideology of Trump and the Republican Party. So I guess I would really kind of disagree a little bit in terms of sort of assessing the election results in terms of Trump successfully having made an appeal to historically Democratic constituents. And I would argue that the story is more people who stayed home, millions of voters who were not compelled by either candidate and so participated at much lower rates.
Thank you. Marianne, can I turn to you? I would also like to ask you the same question. Where do you see differences between the rise of far-right parties, populist parties in Europe and Trumpism in the United States? Or is it the same strategy, the same rhetoric about migrants, what Akasemi also mentioned, and anti-elitism, what you find among many populist parties? But beyond that, where do you see differences?
Well, I guess I agree with Akasemi that it's very similar because you have this very nativist, anti-elitist, anti-woke, anti-migration, this very similar rhetoric across the Atlantic. And it's also this, as you mentioned, this kind of the claim to represent the true people that's very visible in the European rhetoric. So, and the people in their sense would be the majority, and it would tend to be the white Christian majority that needs to be protected against the corrupt elite because, and they represent the true people. And of course, research also has shown that there are these kind of new cleavages that transcend also the Atlantic. The Hogan Marks refer to them as the Gal-Tan cleavage between this more cosmopolitan part of the electorates who are like pro-migration, believe in climate change, etc. And then you have these anti-migration, nationalistic, etc. Voters on the others. So I think we see that across. I think that we also see similarities in terms of strategies because there is this kind of idea of kind of undermining democratic institutions, the illiberal democracy, as it's been called by, or is Orban's favorite name for this system, but it definitely kind of tries to undermine kind of democratic control through the parliament, weaken the electoral systems, etc., etc. But I also agree with Akasemi that there are more checks and balances in the European system because it tends to be more like different kinds of democratic systems. So you have, instead of having the majority system, you have more proportional voting systems. And of course, also the difference in terms of checks and balances in Europe is the European Union, which plays an important role in this sense, because you could have parties, right-wing populist parties who grow strong in one country or even more countries, but that doesn't necessarily translate into power in the European EU system. And since so much of the regulation and the systems of the European states are actually decided through the EU systems, that's also an important check and balance in the system. So that's what we've seen. Even if there are a strong right-wing trends in Europe, this hasn't translated into that much influence in the European Union, except from in the migration policies that I'm sure we will come back to. But yeah, that's a big difference.
Again, a short follow-up question. I mean, I think what is also scary is this connection between multi-billionaires and Trump, such as Elon Musk, for instance, who owns X and has tremendous influence. So, and you also mentioned that, and Akasemi as well, that there are less checks and balances in the United States than in Europe, which is actually surprising, as the United States are always considered, because of its federal system as well, as more of a robust democracy. So would you think, or do you think that the alarm bells that are ringing that fascism is on the rise, is that exaggerated, or do you see a point in that? Is there do we see the return of fascism, if you like, or what's the difference if not?
I think absolutely we should fear the return of fascism. And because, I mean, this growth in far-right and really extreme far-right populist parties like the AfD in Germany, that is obviously a fascist party. I also think that you can't really call Hungary a democracy anymore, and it hasn't been for quite a long time. I mean, it has undermined, it doesn't have an independent judiciary anymore. It controls, Orban controls the media landscape. He stayed in power for 14 years. There's not really free elections. It's not even a free academic environment anymore in Hungary. So that is definitely something we should be concerned with. Of course, that in Europe, there's also this concern with creating firewalls in different countries to kind of reduce the influence of the far right. And also the EU has introduced different types of measures, for example, to force Orban and other countries with far right governments to kind of change their policies, which haven't been, in my opinion, strong enough, but they're becoming stronger. So they're also withholding money now, the transfer money from the EU budget. But I think that in Europe, there is actually two groups of right-wing parties. So or even three. If you look at the European Parliament composition, for example, there is there are some parties who are not included in any political groups like the AfD, because they're too extreme even for Orban, which says quite a bit. So you have the Orban-led Patriots of Europe group, and then you have Meloni's European Conservatives and Reformists groups. And the latter is a bit more moderate than the first. For example, they don't share the very clear, like, pro-Russian stance that Orban's group does, and it's also been supportive of support for Ukraine, for example. But I think another scary aspect of this, that even if their influence so far might have been somewhat limited in the European Union, it has been very influential when it comes to migration policies, like Akasemi mentioned. And even if Europe, for obvious historical reasons, doesn't really call its migration policies deportation, there are really many similarities to the new migration pact and some of the policies that the also EU is conducting now, pushed by Meloni and other far-right leaders in Europe. Which are very problematic in terms of, for example, human rights, international refugee conventions, etc. And we also see this change in discourse in Europe now. So you see even mainstream parties kind of moving to the right in their rhetoric. So in that sense, I think the rhetoric we hear about minorities and migrants in Europe now would not even have been accepted in the same way just a few years ago. So I think there are big challenges in many countries, but there are also these kind of broader challenges across Europe.
Thank you. Jeroen, I hand over to you.
Very good. Thank you so much, Cengiz. Let me maybe start with Wolfgang, if that's okay for you, Wolfgang. And very first question would be your first reaction to the victory of Donald Trump in the recent elections we here had in the United States, and perhaps also your ideas about differences about the rise of the far right in Europe and the electoral victory of Donald Trump in the United States.
Well, I was not surprised, but I was shocked, of course, because I'm afraid that now Mr. Trump knows the ins and outs of governance in the United States. And now his appointees already attest to the fact that he really wants, from day one, he wants a different United States and clearly also a different foreign policy. And I think this is where European Union comes in. There are parallels, of course, and there are similarities and there are differences. The political system, and this was already mentioned, is different. I was always of the opinion that actually a two-party system is much better because you get clear-cut decisions. Whereas when you have more than two parties, it's always sort of coalition and, it's power brokering and so on. And people feel something is happening behind closed doors and they don't know actually who calls the shots. Now, having a look at the US system, and already at the British system, in a way, you can see that actually this two-party system is only working if both parties subscribe to a democratic to the democratic principles. And I believe that the Republican Party in the United States has really moved away. This started with the Tea Party movement and then went on through many other phases. And in a way now it's the Trump triumph that makes a very clear point. The United States is not a two-party system any longer. You have still the Democratic Party on the one hand, but you do not have the Republican Party any longer. The Republican Party is now really a Trump party. Yeah. Whereas in the European system, as I said, with this multi-party system, the problems are obvious. There's endless negotiating till you bring about a coalition government, and this is getting more and more difficult and more cumbersome. But at the same time, it also prevents this kind of takeover by extremists. Yeah. So the populist movement, which, by the way, I think the expression populism is not any longer applicable. It's populism used to be a movement connected with one person, and it came and went. This is not any longer the case, neither in Europe nor in the United States, but particularly in Europe. And now we do see structural changes. Why? Because the traditional left of center, right of center, two big parties that dominate the political process are no longer in existence, which means more than one party, more than two parties are necessary in order to forge a government. And this, as I said, is of the advantage when it comes to preventing and erecting a firewall or forging coalitions that keep the extremists outside. But at the same time, it is a defensive appeal, so to speak. It is very defensive because it is not so much about a proactive engagement in politics, in providing a coherent program for the future. It is more to defend the status quo. And that will go on for a while. But unless the traditional parties, democratic parties in Europe, find a way to tackle the new problems, to tackle the issues, social issues in particular, this is not going to succeed forever.
Yeah, Wolfgang, if I may, just one brief follow-up question. Would you agree that we're currently witnessing a return of some form of fascism, or do you feel that the use of words like fascism and other comparisons with the 1930s, 40s are not really helpful to understand the current situation. How do you feel about this?
Well, as a European, as an Austrian in particular, we had our own fascism in the 1930s and, of course, the Nazis. I'm extremely careful when using this expression. I know in the United States the discussion is a bit different, but when you look at the substance, so to speak, at the features, there you can definitely see there is a fascist, how should I say, there are fascist features around. More so maybe in the current Trump situation, with this mass support for Trump, for example, the authoritarian notion that is put forward, the acceptance that the rule of law, the institutions, or as we say in Austria, or as the Freedom Party, our extremist party says, the system is now at the disposal. So in this way, yes, there are fascist features in there, and we need to be extremely careful when we see them. And the difficulty really is how do you deal with these authoritarian and even worse features that are around in a democratic way. Elections in itself obviously do not do the whole job, but it is important, of course, to stick to elections. But there is a more, in my opinion, you need to go much deeper into the society, into the root causes of the election results.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Wolfgang. And that's definitely a point that we want to get back to later in the conversation. At this point, I would like to ask Daniela for your first reaction to the victory of Donald Trump in the recent elections here in the United States, comparisons to parallels to the rise of far-right parties on both sides of the Atlantic in Europe as well, and what differences potentially you see between the far-right in Europe and Trump in the United States, Daniela.
Thanks a lot for the questions. I'm going to try to combine these two in one answer and try to be relatively short. So, in a sense, of course, everybody was surprised because I suppose most people in Europe probably would have wanted to have a different result. But looking at the rhetoric that was used in this case, and then looking at the rhetoric that the far right is using in Europe, then we see similar dynamics. So very high percentages, obviously not as high as in the US, but still very high if we compare to previous phases. And I think the key to understanding this dynamic is really looking at the topics that are being used. And I'm also going to talk very few sentences about the commonalities that I've seen in, and then list a couple of differences. First, this very strong emphasis on the financial aspect. Yeah. So obviously it was very important in the US, but it's also very important here. So if you look at the discourse, for example, of the far right in Austria or Germany, then yes, it's about migration, but it is especially about the financial situation of people. So what these actors are trying to sell is the fact that, there's going to be this big and strong savior that is going to fix everything. Yeah. So we have this idea of this very strong actor, obviously authoritarian picture of things, who will fix it for people who now feel insecure, whose financial situation has become worse after various types of crises. Another parallel is the idea of, building walls. Here we have the Citadel Europe that one wants to build. Around it also the topic of, anti all these measures for climate in the area of climate and climate change is something that is here also fought against. And what I think is most important and really a central idea is this polarization of society. This is defining of two camps of us, who is the real us and who are they. And they are, of course, the left, the LGBTQ community, the Muslims. I think this anti-Muslim rhetoric is very important on both sides of the Atlantic. So we see here really very many parallels that maybe remind us a little bit of the past, but I think many of the topics are actually quite contemporary. So I agree with Wolfgang that, the terms like fascism might be misleading because we have a different historical context now. And just to finish up in terms of differences, I think I think the big difference between the US and Germany and Austria is the historical past. So, and still the awareness of this historical past that basically limits the kinds of things that you can say here. So, for example, making Austria great again would be rather problematic. Same thing with Germany. So this kind of rhetoric is here difficult to push. Another thing which is very important is the sensitivity to the historical past, in particular, the Nazi past and things like symbols. So very many things in the US are allowed and here are banned. So in the US, there's more leeway and more space for various kinds of even neo-Nazi and similar movements to develop and gain ground. So here, I think there's a bit more awareness and a bit more barriers to this kind of currents, and also a very strong opposition, especially in the left and the extreme left. But still, you have a very active civil society here doing lots of things on very many levels, to the point that one was actually afraid that in case, the far right doesn't get enough votes, you're going to have violence from the far right. And then if they do get a lot of votes, you're going to have violence from the far left. So the society in Europe, I think, is extremely politicized, and is not afraid to go out on the streets, for the right topic. And really just to finish up here, because you guys were saying, are we dealing with the return of fascism? I think our problem is actually a lot bigger. We have been socialized in a society that assumes that, democracy and human rights are universal and, are just there and, will be there forever. But I think now we're in a situation where there's a very strong competition from a different side, who basically is trying to convince the mainstream population that, it doesn't have to be this way. And they seem to be very successful at doing it.
Daniela, one brief follow-up question for you. We talked about Europe, we talked about the United States, but we do see, right, certain fascist-like tendencies also in other parts of the world. Think of Erdogan in Turkey, think of Modi in India. We had the case of Bolsonaro in Brazil. So would you say what we're witnessing today is a global phenomenon, or would you say it's really a specifically Western phenomenon?
Well, I think, there is this Western normative model that we have managed to establish after the Second World War. And it has been there for a while, but then, I don't think it's a new phenomenon that we are observing now, that basically there's been threats to it in the last decades, if it's, China or Russia, and others. So I think basically what we're witnessing at the global systemic level is a very big challenge to this normative system, which we thought, it's universal and everybody will think it's great. But obviously, we have these other tendencies and also a very strong identity politics. So, away from this kind of universal idea of, rights for everyone and equality for everyone, to know, it's us and we have to protect ourselves against those others and build walls and such. So I think that's what we're dealing with right now.
Very good. Thank you so much. Putting it back to you, Cengiz.
Thank you. I like this co-moderation, to be honest. Thank you. Akasemi, I would let's now start looking into the future. What does all this mean? I know none of us has the crystal ball. But what would be your analysis? We now know that some of the nominations of President Trump for several posts in his future administration, and so there you can already see in which direction it's going to go. How would you analyze the impact of 4 years of President Trump and a radicalized Republican Party on the American political system and the state and its policies as such?
That's a very big question, Cengiz. And of course, no one can see the future. That said, I would say at minimum, we're headed for extremely bumpy times ahead. Whether that's if we consider the issue of migration and President-elect Trump's promise on day one to begin deportation of millions of undocumented immigrants from the United States, which would obviously have implications for relations with our southern neighbors, primarily Mexico, in terms of their capacity to receive millions of people, and then considering the infrastructure and human cost that it would take on American society to locate millions of people, rip them from their families and neighborhoods, house them, and then move them. It would be not only a domestic crisis of really unprecedented proportions, but an international crisis as well in terms of where are people going to go and what nations would be receiving them. So, if Trump even attempts to implement this policy, which he has promised repeatedly, I think we're looking at a dire situation indeed. Let me touch on two other issues that I think would be important for thinking about the future with 4 more years of Trump. I think another important issue has to be considered around Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the future of NATO and the Transatlantic partnership. It's pretty clear from the nominations for various ambassadorial positions that Trump has publicized and listed that he is picking loyalists as opposed to experts with longstanding ties to international organizations. His campaign rhetoric has been one in which it's been very pro-Putin, so and very anti-NATO. So this definitely does not portend well for the transatlantic relationship going forward. And then I would say really a challenge has to be the success of Trump's ideology, really around promoting white identitarian politics, white supremacy, and interestingly enough, fellow political scientists and sociologists, Christina Beltran at NYU, and in the European case, Manuela Boatska at the Freiburg University, have started discussing really multiracial white supremacy. So this idea that people of color in the United States, these could be Latinos, these could be immigrants from global South countries in European contexts, these could be immigrants or individuals with backgrounds from Muslim majority countries, this idea that they can shed their identities and their cultural markers and join in citizenship of cruelty against more recent immigrants to establish the nation. The growth of this ideology, I think, is quite disturbing, but also offers a pathway for not only white American citizens and white European citizens, but citizens with migration backgrounds, citizens that we speak of as people of color, to join in making a more homogenous nationalist approach to politics. So I think these three things are really not going to go away when it comes to the migration policy, when it comes to threats to the transatlantic relationship and international institutions, and then when it comes to really the appeal of this ideology of white identity politics on both sides of the Atlantic. These are things we will be grappling with for at least the next 4 years.
Again, a follow-up question. How do you think has this, or is this going to impact the Democratic Party? Are they somehow adapting regarding the migration issue to the Trump rhetoric? I mean, if you compare the policies under Biden and Trump, there isn't so much difference when it comes to, I don't know, migration, yes, visa regulations, as well as trade policies. So is there actually Trumpism that has infiltrated also large parts of society beyond the Republican Party? Is that, isolationism in its very pure form that we will see also much beyond Trump too?
I think the future of the Democratic Party is very much up for grabs. I think there are definitely sort of warring factions that are doing a postmortem right now to try and understand what went wrong with the recent U.S. presidential election. And there's a lot of blame and finger pointing going on. But I think it really remains to be seen, for example, if the Democratic Party can reframe a conception of the working class, which many scholars in public health and sociology point out is not a male manufacturing group. The U.S. working class is primarily women who are involved in care work, care for children, care for the elderly that are very low paid. And yet the rhetoric from both the Republican and the Democratic parties in the United States was around a mythic image of a male manufacturing worker and bringing manufacturing back. So I think there's certainly some openings to activate the millions of women with migration backgrounds, women from biracial minorities, Black women who sat out the election by reconfiguring kind of what we think of when we think of the working class. And I would argue that in West European politics as well, something that has really been underexplored is what this means for new citizens of color in Germany, in the Netherlands, who are being targeted by right-wing parties as not part of the nation, and in many ways are not really seen as full-fledged members to be courted by, for example, social democratic parties or green parties. And we're lacking a lot of data in terms of how these newer groups of citizens understand what's these new developments with populism in European politics, of which they are the target. So I think that's something I look forward to seeing much more research when it comes to these topics.
Thank you, Akasemi. Marianne, are we in a kind of post-liberal world already? Is it, is, also this strong alliance between the United States and Europe that was built after the Second World War and based on common values such as democracy, the promotion of human rights, is that all over with the rise of the far right in Europe and Trump in the United States? And how do you think that a new relationship under these circumstances will look like?
Again, a very big question. Of course, it's about the transatlantic relationship, and it's about the world order as such, because they're intertwined, of course. I hope not. I think they're, at least in Europe, hopefully, and also in the United States, hopefully there will be forces who are strong enough to come back and protect these values. But it's, of course, the election of Donald Trump, it kind of plays into the far right's, the European far right's vision of what the transatlantic relationship should look like. Because as you mentioned, it's been based on security, free trade, etc., but also these kind of common values linked to international rule-based order, democracy, human rights, that also Daniela mentioned that we kind of have been taken for granted, I guess, which is scary, but we have. So this kind of imagining a new type of right-wing transatlantic relationship might kind of undermine this, of course. From the European far right's perspective, for example, Orban's perspective, he sees this as an opportunity to redefine the West, right? So it should be, I'm using him as an example now, but he wants this kind of US-led coalition that is kind of based on a much looser organization and very conservative values, as the ones we have mentioned and discussed already. And also, they would also like the Trump to be the leader of this new transatlantic coalition somehow. What it really entails in practice, I don't know. It is mainly focused on this promotion of Christian values, anti-woke, anti-liberal left, the anti-immigration, etc. But it hasn't really kind of been spelled out. But we know that there are also strong links more also at the grassroots level. For example, right-wing think tanks in Europe cooperating with the Heritage Foundation, etc., etc. So there is a lot of actual work going on across the Atlantic in attempts at undermining this. For example, there are lots of cooperation, US organizations supporting right-wing court cases, for example, in Europe. So there is a lot of things that are going not only at the elite level, but also at the kind of grassroots level, so which is also scary. But that is, yeah. What will it mean for Europe? I think we're seeing generally in the world, we're seeing a more of a regionalization in different regions of the world. And we also see, of course, this big push against the liberal order that was created by the United States. So it's also very much foreign, but also from other countries like China, Russia, Brazil, other countries. So we will see big changes. What happens in Europe? I do hope that Europe will be able to, so far at least, even if there are big changes in terms of migration, etc., and the discourse, as I mentioned, there is still, the main parties are still trying to push back against this, fortunately. So it's scary to try to look ahead, but this is, I think that this undermining of the transatlantic order is very much coming from within, from the populist right, and it's also from the grassroots. So there's a lot of things that need to be studied further.
Just maybe to highlight that this isn't the only dynamic in the entire picture. When you look at it, there are always counter movements and counter dynamics. What would be important counter dynamics you can kind of see and observe that are important to mention in this discussion?
In Europe or in the United States or both?
Both.
Well, institutions, of course. Mm-hmm. That is what we tend to rely on when we want to we need strong institutions, strong rule of law systems that can kind of, and its institutions are hard to break. And in that sense, I also think that the transatlantic relationship is stronger than whoever is the president in the United States, because there are so many strong networks, there are so many institutions, there are so much cooperation, and a lot of also democratically focused cooperation and institutions. And you have, even if the United States, now United Nations isn't working perfectly now, of course, you still have cooperation in many of the United Nations forums, you still have meetings, you still have a lot of cooperation in Europe through the European Union. It's not a perfect democratic system in any sense, but at least it continues to be based on certain values and institutional structures that I think will withstand, hopefully, these pressures, even if it will be difficult. And even if we see some kind of what we refer to as breaking down when it comes to the kind of migration policies, as I mentioned, which are very problematic.
Thank you, Marianne. Jeroen.
Yes, Wolfgang and Daniela, I have a little bit of a different follow-up question for you in the sense that we witness different reactions by mainstream parties to the electoral victories of the far-right parties, right? In the US, we have a policy of the winner takes it all, even though this winner, had barely more than 50% of the votes. In Europe, the main question is whether or not we should include far-right parties in a coalition government. And hence my question for you, do you feel it is a democratic thing to do to say, well, we will respect the election results and we will we see an increase in popular support for far-right parties, hence it is a democratic thing to do to include them in a coalition government. And we've seen that in the case of the Netherlands recently. We've also seen it in some Nordic countries. Or would you say it is actually democratic not to do this and to explicitly exclude far-right parties from access to power by forming some sort of anti-right-wing coalition, a type of cordon or firewall, with the argument that the values of such parties do not correspond to those of a liberal democracy, right? So where do you stand on this? And maybe Wolfgang, we start with you.
Okay. How should I start? I should say both yes and no. Actually, it depends. So these are the words, these are the expressions actually that we have to have a look at the specific cases, so to speak. Like we do have this discussion right now in Austria, and the difference to let's say the Freedomites, the Freedom Party from before, let's say before Kickl, is that definitely under Kickl, the FPÖ in Austria has become more extremist in its expressions, in its plans, in its proposals, in its threats. So therefore, I believe it is legitimate to exclude the number one party that won the elections, but the election results are way below 50%. It's not even 30%. So more than 70% of the electorate voted against Kickl, against the Freedom Party. So therefore, in our political system, multi-party system, if a coalition of, like, as it is being negotiated right now, of three parties, the number two, the Conservative Party, the People's Party, the Social Democrats as the number three, and the Liberals, the Liberals as number four. If they succeed in hammering out the program, then be it, yeah. In other countries, like in the northern, in the Scandinavian countries, or also in the Netherlands, other solutions were found. So what we're witnessing now is actually a certain breaking up and more flexibility when it comes to forge coalition governments, to find an absolute majority and to create a government. So in a way, this is actually what democracy is all about. In the past, particularly in Austria, but also in Germany, the feeling was, well, there's always the same, it's either left of center or it's right of center. And the people got disappointed. But now we do have a situation where more political flexibility is necessary. But I believe precisely because of this, it will be very important in the future to stick to the democratic basics. And this is a discussion that needs to take place both in the European member states as well as at the European level. The problem is actually that we will not be able, as Austria or as any of the member states, even Germany or France, to go it alone. We need the European Union. And the European Union as a project is really under threat. Why? And this is now again, so to speak, related to the United States and to the Trump victory. The European integration is based on the post-World War II consensus and order established by the United States. And now it's the very United States which is undermining this post-1945 order, and in this way, indirectly also, the understanding of what the European integration actually means. So this is the real challenge that I see emanating from Washington and from the Trump victory. How to deal with it will be the real challenge for the European Union, and it will go way beyond the next 4 years. This is in a way also what a Zeitenwende, so to speak, a European political policy Zeitenwende, very, very fundamental. And how the European Union is going to manage this will be crucial for the future of the European Union. In regard to the issues of the transatlantic relationship, I'm sure it's going to be much more difficult. I think when it comes to NATO or the security issue, it is in a way positive that the Europeans will have to finally get the act together. I give you a few numbers in order to see how paradox the whole discussion actually is. We're always talking about, particularly Mr. Trump is talking, Europe has to spend more on its own security. Now, when we look at the figures, at the mere figures, you see that the United States has a defense budget of over 900 billion. Russia has about 110, China more than 300. Europe, the EU 27 have a defense budget of more than 500 billion. So it is not about more money in order to get more security to Europe. It is about integrating the armed forces. It's about doing more for the defense in terms of working together, aligning, deepening the relationship. And in a way, by joining NATO from Finland and Sweden, NATO has become more European. But of course, it is still way, way far away from an efficient European defense system. This we need to say very loud, you know. And so this is the challenge for the European Union. And when we see how now the United States might move away, I mean, I'm sure they will also realize actually the only a partner that the United States has on the safe side, so to speak, is, of course, Europe. But if there is a conflict, then we'll see how the things work out. Let me make one last point to this, and this is the trade relations. You know, for the European Union, the United States is a very important trading partner. And I remember very vividly when the first Trump administration came into place, and immediately there were talks about putting up taxes and customs and so on. The same adage goes now, of course. But then, when the then European Commission President, Mr. Juncker, had a meeting with Mr. Trump, all of a sudden there was no talk any longer about a trade war. Why? Because Europe spoke with one voice. And of course, we know that trade issues are the only ones that are fully integrated, where the European Union speaks for all 27 members. And this is for the European the way forward. That's the only way. And we'll see what comes out. I'm not so sure that Mr. Trump is going to follow through with his customs and all this stuff. I think there are more flexible solutions that also the Europeans could offer.
Yeah, Wolfgang, one brief follow-up question. So you speak about the integration of the armed forces, of deepening relationships in terms of defense, also about the fact that with Finland and Sweden joining the NATO, NATO has become more European. But that raises the question, your own country, Austria, is not a member of NATO. So I would love to hear where you stand on this. Would you say that now is the time for Austria to follow the example of Finland and Sweden and to join NATO, or do you have a different view?
Well, I tell you, this is clearly a big question, and the simple answer would be yes, Austria should join. But I'm along with about 80% of the population in Austria, not of this opinion. I think we need to, on the other hand, see what we can add to the security and defense of Europe, of the European Union, of our lifestyle, of our welfare state, of the economic issues and all this stuff. And here, I believe there is a lot that needs to be done, ought to be done, should be done. And if we agree that more than 80% of the threats for Austria, and clearly also for Europe as such, are of a non-military nature, then I think there's a lot that Austria could contribute. So I see that this is something which clearly needs to be discussed. I'm very much for an open discussion, and there's a certain, how should I say, in Austria you don't talk about it. Even the federal chancellor said, well, we are neutral and that's full stop. I don't think this is the right approach. I believe we shouldn't talk about NATO yes or no, neutrality yes or no. We should and have to talk about what is the best for Austria's and for Europe's security. For me, the frame of reference for Austria is always the European Union. We're not going to succeed alone. We need to be in a solidary relationship, so to speak. We need to think European much more than we do right now. That's also going to be the only thing to meet up, so to speak, the US and the definitely different situation that Europe is going to be confronted with in so many areas. But I do believe that things can be done. Europe is not as weak as it sometimes believes itself it is.
Thank you. Daniela, I turn to you and first with the same question, right? Is it a democratic thing to do to include far-right parties in a coalition government if they win the elections, or do you think it's a democratic thing not to do this and to try to exclude them by forming a broad anti-right-wing coalition? Where do you stand in this discussion?
I think my opinion is somewhat less balanced than Wolfgang, so I would definitely be against including them in the coalition. I want to give a little bit of background. So I think, it's not really a new situation. It has to be clear for, us also and people who listen to us that, these parties have already been at government. Even in Austria, the Right Party has been in government before, and not in a prominent role, but they were able to influence certain things. Also, at the regional level, they are in the regional government. And what is even more important, we have a very strong mainstreaming of ideas among the mainstream parties in Europe, mainly among the conservative ones, but in some countries, even among the left-wing parties. So we already have a very strong presence of this discourse and of these actors in European politics. Now, the question is, do we want to give them even a more prominent role? Do we actually want to make them, have them lead the government? Because, that would happen, for example, in Austria in that case. And the answer is definitely no. And I think, here locally, it was very, I think it was a decision of one person, perhaps, who led to this result. But it was one person that had a very inside view of what is going to happen if this party actually gets to power. Why? Because of a lot of actions that they did before, which had very clear extremist tendencies. Now, trying to be more theoretical here, I think the problem that we have with democracy is that there seems to be an assumption that the majority will make the right choice. But if you have actors who are very, very skillful in manipulating public opinion, you might have a situation where the majority will not make the right choice. And we had this experience before in Europe. So, it's not a theoretical question. It's an empirical fact that this thing might happen. So the problem is that we need to have, I guess I'll call it now a risk assessment system for democracy. Yeah. And not just, which we should actually work before, because, these parties do have extremist tendencies. And these are things that one can actually establish very quickly. If we think about, for example, division of power in state, the far-right party here has said at some point, the law should adapt to politics and not the politics to the law. I think that's a very clear statement. If we look at certain kinds of human rights, in particular human dignity, something that these parties have absolutely no consideration for. Now, the problem is that the only way in which you can go legally after these parties or organizations is by banning them. And the criteria for banning these organizations and parties are actually very strict, and it's very difficult to do this kind of things. Legally, they would have to actually try to actively undermine, the state. So, I think the idea is not whether or not they should be empowered. The question is rather, how can we create a mechanism for a better protection of democracy against actors who actually want to undermine it?
Daniela, I see your point, right? But some people could say, look at your neighboring country of Switzerland, right? A country where the far-right party, SVP, has been part of the government for decades, and still democracy in Switzerland is strong. Why couldn't this work in Austria? So how do you feel about this comparison between Austria and Switzerland? Does it make sense at all?
Well, I think the issue with far right is that it's a very broad term. So I think in the end, one would have to really come back to the very core definition of democracy, and especially focus on certain elements of it, and see if these are actually fulfilled in certain cases, yes or no. It'll probably be superficial to say that the entire far right in Europe is the same. Of course, it's not the same. So, it's really not about what to do with the far right in general. It's what to do with certain parties and certain actors who have certain discourses. Because even the same party might have a different discourse, in after 5 years. I wouldn't agree with the fact that it has changed that much here. If we think about, times when they would say that basically Islam doesn't belong here, and, I mean, you can see a certain continuity. But the idea is to say, it's a very contextual question to ask, to which extent when an actor is actually still conforms to democracy or not.
Thank you so much. Turning it back to you, Cengiz.
Thank you. I think we do now have some time until we close to address some of the questions that were posed in the Q&A. Here you see there is a number 13 below Jeroen. And I've gone through some of them, and I can't read out all of them, of course, but maybe what I've observed in some of these questions that were posed more at the beginning of our discussion were reactions to what Akasemi and Marianne said, that actually they believe that in Europe there are stronger checks and balances than in the United States. And I see some of our members of our audience kind of reacting to that. Could you explore a bit on that? Why do you think that the United States do have less checks and balances than in Europe? Because as I don't remember who it was, mentions that Andre Goodfriend says, well, in the United States you have the federal system, and you have they have their own parliaments and making their own laws. So you do have some different balances, which could be compared to the European Union, if you like. You have national states and Brussels then compared to Washington, D.C. and the federal states. So maybe Akasemi, what would be your reaction to that question?
I think that's really an excellent question. And when I was speaking of the differences between the U.S. electoral system and the with its winner-take-all two-party system and the electoral systems we have present in many Western European countries, which are parliamentary style, I was referring primarily to, the head of government electoral contest. So certainly in the U.S. case, the guardrails that I was referring to in terms of, party politics around the election of the president, I think that there are, in fact, fewer guardrails around this head of government executive role election. Now, I see that in the questions it was pointed out, Congress is being an example of an institutional guardrail. In the specific case of our current recent election in the U.S., we know that the Trump Republican Party has won majorities in the House, the lower House of Congress, the House of Representatives, and the Senate. And we have already seen hand-picked judicial appointees in the U.S. Supreme Court that have really pushed policies forward that Trump has wanted. So actually, across the three branches of government, we are seeing really one party control ahead of us in the next 4 years. So in this case, with these, election results driven by the presidential politics of Donald Trump, we don't see those guardrails in terms of different parties, the Democrats, controlling houses of Congress. So in the past, certainly that has happened, but I think we're facing really a new situation in which on the campaign trail, Trump had said to constituents that there would not be any more elections, that people would only need to vote one more time if they voted for him. And then not to be forgotten, of course, is his key leading role in the attempt to overturn the election results of January 6th. Which is really a authoritarian move to consolidate power. So the guardrails that we had taken for granted in the United States have really fallen by the wayside as Trump has rattled them. So I think this is a different situation when we look at the ability of far-right parties to act similarly across different West European countries. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Akasemi. Marianne, maybe I could pose this question to you. Several people asked about the question whether the rise of far-right populism isn't connected to actually a growing social gap in society. And yet, when we look at the results, be it in the United States electoral results or in Europe, it's actually marginalized groups that mainly vote also for these far-right populist groups. And in the case of the United States, it's Donald Trump, a multi-millionaire who kind of has become the new Robin Hood of the poor. So how can we explain this? That actually marginalized people have shifted away from their traditional representatives and parties and are more attracted by people and rhetorics that are actually very neoliberal and even against their own interests.
Yeah, well, I think that many of the far-right parties in Europe actually has quite left-wing also rhetoric in many aspects. So it's like, of course, a big difference between the United States and Europe to begin with is, of course, the social system, the welfare systems that we have in Europe, which creates some safeguards for all of the population. But we see in many right-wing populist or yeah, that was another question, but I'll just going to use this term now. Right-wing populist parties, that they are populist in the sense that they also talk to the non-privileged parts of the population and also promises quite a bit in terms of welfare goods, right? So you would have this kind of right-wing majority nativist, but at the same time promising people better healthcare, cheaper energy, etc., etc. So it's kind of a different discourse in this sense. But I also think that what we see in Europe is many elections are protest elections. So you tend to see that in the European Parliament elections and also in many of the national elections, that people tend to vote for the parties who are not in power. And it tends also then to be the right-wing parties. They have the easy solutions to many of their everyday problems, and they're not in power. So that's also a protest vote. But just if I could just also briefly come back to this point about checks and balances in the European system. I think, of course, I agree with Akasemi that in the United States you have the federal system, the states. In the European Union, it's the other way around. You have the checks and balances from the European integration or the EU system, which is very different from what it used to be in the beginning. Of course, it's a very, very tightly integrated political unity that regulates almost everything, from like transport to trade to common market to increasingly also health, defense, migration, etc. So, and it's a system where you don't have that kind. It's very consensus oriented, and you don't have this kind of one strong executive in the same sense as you do in Germany and now in the United States. And you also, I also think another big difference is the court system in Europe and in the United States, because the United States has a political court, and we have seen that very clearly now with the powers of the executive that has been by the Supreme Court has underlined that is almost unlimited for a president. While you have non-political courts that can provide more of a checks and balance in the European system. So you have this kind of very multi-level de facto federal system also in Europe, with the European Union limiting the influence of the far right, at least so far, and you have a broader coalition then that can kind of stand up against it. You have a legal system that has developed and that differently, and where the European legal systems are so integrated, and you have a legal system that is also part of the European Union system, which is non-political. So I think there are some checks and balances there that you don't have in the same sense in the United States system. And of course, in the United States, it's very based on also informal norms and procedures, right? So, which is also a different system than the one we have in Europe.
Thank you. Jeroen?
Yeah. Wolfgang, let me follow up with you on a comment you made on the election results on both sides of the Atlantic, actually, as those results being a threat to the European Union, even an existential threat. And I want to connect that to a question from the audience on Ukraine, because we haven't really discussed the Ukraine crisis yet. As you know, the entire European project was once aimed at never again having another great war in Europe. But now with Ukraine, we have a war that is escalating, right? With North Korea becoming involved, etc. So I wanted to ask you about the effects, especially of Trump's victory for the war on Ukraine, and how Putin potentially will benefit from this election result, and if yes, in what way?
Well, it will very much depend on how the administration, Mr. Trump, decides on the perspective and the view on Ukraine. Is this something where the US would think, okay, we cannot lose this war because we're part of it, we have invested so much, or is Mr. Trump going to say, and this is more likely, in my opinion, well, let me prove that I can end wars. You know, He's very proud of it, that during his first administration there were no wars. Well, it's not really true, but and also then under Biden, the wars that broke out in Ukraine or in the Middle East were, of course, not now initiated by the United States. But anyhow, in this way, Europe is very much dependent on how the United States will decide its approach to the war. Is it going to try to forge a peace, or just the end of the conflict somehow? Is it going to be in favor of freezing the conflict and creating a situation similar to the one between the two Koreas, for example, to have a demarcation line crossing now through the eastern part of Ukraine, and in this way enlarging Europe in comparison to the Cold War, where this demarcation line went straight through Germany, for example. These are all open questions, and I believe in this short period of time now, for over the next couple of months, where the peace issue is going to be much stronger, and it has been for quite some time quite strong in Europe as well, to say, let's finish the war. But as long as Germany is supporting the war, I believe it's not going to just come to an end. But it is decisive what the United States is going to do. And also in Germany, they will have elections also rather sooner than later. We will also see there whether this whole situation in Ukraine will change it anyway. I pity the Ukrainians in this way, because they are so much now dependent on the United States and on Europe, and cannot do a lot for themselves. But this is just the situation as it presents itself now. For Europe, the question is whether Ukraine gets a just peace, a peace that will be somehow a compromise, somehow acceptable to Ukraine or not. One thing is sure, Europe will have to deal with the conflict, whether there is a ceasefire or not, whether there is a peace agreement or not. It will be directly affected by the outcome. And there, the United States will play an outsized role. Yeah, so that's the situation, a situation of uncertainty. And you also see that the lack of initiatives on the part of Brussels, on the part of the European Union, to find ways and means to deal with Putin and to try to find a compromise, a solution, or something like this, has really not been at the forefront, unfortunately. Europe much depended too much, I would say, on the United States. This has changed now, and the situation of uncertainty will actually dominate the headlines, and of course also the policies and politics in the new Commission in Brussels. We do have now a new administration there, and the question will be, what kind of role can the European Union get still? And this depends, again, fully on Mr. Trump, unfortunately. It is one of the most difficult situations for the European Union in many, many years, I would say. This change from multilateral issues to deal in a multilateral way, which is what the European Union is good at, to now this kind of great power competition situation of conflicts, of wars. And it's not just Ukraine. A war in our neighborhood. Another war, of course, is in the Middle East, where the European Union, again, does not play the role as it. Well, the gist of all of this, and maybe the consequences, the political consequences, we need a stronger European Union. I don't see it right around the corner, but this is what we really need to focus on if Europe wants to become an actor in global politics, at least in Europe and on its and in the neighboring regions, Ukraine in particular, relations with Russia and the Middle East.
Thank you for that, Wolfgang. And Daniela, a different question for you from the audience, namely the suggestion that the equation of populism with right-wing politics could perhaps be too simple, and also the observation that we see similar tendencies on the far left. The example mentioned by one of the people following us today is the development of a new party in Germany, established by Sarah Wagenknecht, the BSW. One could also mention the case of Mélenchon in France. Do you think that the ideas, right, as we see in the case of Wagenknecht and Mélenchon, could also be labeled as a form of populism? And could it be that not just forms of populism on the right, but also forms of populism on the left could potentially become a threat to peace and democracy in the West?
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously, populism is not just on the right side of the political spectrum. You also have left-wing populist parties, and populism as such is not a threat from a security perspective. It becomes a threat, associates itself with extremism. So for me, this is the feature that basically signals the fact that there is a problem with the political party. Populism might not be something good for democracy, but it's not a security threat in itself. May I address just a couple of two other things that were mentioned?
Please. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think somebody asked about the causes for the rise of the far right. And just very briefly, at least for Europe, I mean, the rise of the far right is usually associated with crisis. So in this case, we had a financial crisis, but even before, and this is relatively new, it was the whole COVID-associated crisis, and not necessarily as financial, but in the sense that it allowed these far-right parties to basically delegitimate the government and spread conspiracy theories. This has led very much to this kind of increased support for the idea of, the establishment is actually part of a, world conspiracy. The establishment is not looking after your interests and so forth. And then thirdly, that we have a very strong identity politics going on for a very long time. And we basically see the fruits of this phenomenon. We'll be having it around for a very long time. I also wanted to say something about why immigrants might vote for the far right. And here the issue, I mean, there's two things. There's two topics in the far right discourse and if I may say, propaganda that can resonate also with this target group. One is the idea of, kind of instilling envy and fear in a group, saying that they will not have the privileges that these newly arrived immigrants will have. I mean, it can even be, basic things like, see, all the asylum seekers have phones for free, and you don't even have this and that. They have so much money from the government, and you don't. You actually been here for a while, you work, and you get a lot less. So basically, it's, instilling this kind of sentiments in the old immigrants against the new immigrants. And the other thing is also the framing of, as we say, cultural racism. So basically spreading hate, not based on race, but based on culture, and arguing that, the European culture is different than, say, the Muslim culture. And it so happens that the newly arrived immigrants are from Muslim countries, are from outside Europe. They're not from, say, Bosnia, Serbia, as they used to be. So this is something that resonates very much, or can resonate with people who are themselves immigrants, but would choose to vote for the far right nevertheless.
Thank you so much, Daniela. We are exactly 1 minute before the end of our session, and thank you everybody who has participated in this discussion. Thank you, Jeroen, for the co-moderation. And thank you all the audience who has stayed with us here until 8:30 and in the morning in California. Looking forward, I don't think we have all the answers, but I think we have touched upon many different issues that are of importance to the future of our democracies and the future of transatlantic relations. Do you have some concluding remarks, Jeroen? Do you want to?
Just very briefly, thanking all the people who followed us today, obviously, but also wanted to thank our speakers, Wolfgang, Daniela, Akasemi, and Marianne, for your excellent comments, but also thank you, Cengiz, for this opportunity. We're very grateful about this opportunity to work together with the Austrian Institute for International Affairs. And I hope that this is not a single event, that this will potentially be the beginning of a series of events that we can organize together.
That's the plan. And just a very last remark, we've recorded this session and we will put it online and distribute it. And you're all invited to share it with friends and colleagues through social media, if you like. Thank you so much. And all the best to everybody. Bye.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.